I was sort of talking about how public health needs to have leadership, and we know there's other sectors that have been hard hit, including food processing, meat processing, agriculture workers, foreign workers, and quite frankly, jails, where people are incarcerated. All of those are areas where I want to see public health really take leadership on the issue of mandatory vaccination.
So, Dr. Harmon, when we're taking a look at what actually governs this area legally, obviously we know in certain sectors unions and collective agreements are a consideration, a very strong consideration. But what other legal issues are we looking at that employers are having to consider here, or even governments are having to consider on the mandating of vaccines?
Well, if you're thinking about government as an employer, there'll be charter rights implicated because the government has to comply with the charter at all times. If it's a purely private context, then it would be human rights legislation from province to province, or also the government or the federal sector through the Canadian Human Rights Act. So those are the big hurdles, and Dr. Gupta or Ms. Gupta already addressed some of the concerns related to the human rights context already. But basically, an employer would have to show that this vaccination is a bona fide occupational requirement. And so, there are challenges in relation to that, and it will depend entirely on context and on sector and a whole bunch of different factors.
So you're not seeing a broad-based application. You think that if there's going to be anything, it will be industry specific, or even more specific at a subset level?
I suspect so, and we already see in Canada some few examples of mandated vaccinations in specific sectors. So in Ontario, under the Ambulance Act, medical attendants and paramedics need to be vaccinated. Again, in Ontario, school pupils, there's what you might consider a soft mandate there, in that there are exceptions and you can access those exceptions through a certain process. In Nova Scotia, anyone who runs a daycare facility has to keep on record the immunization record of their children who they are caring for, which suggests that the children have to be immunized. So there are limited sort of industry-specific or business-specific mandates that already exist.
And when you're referring to some of this other legislation, generally the legislation has exemptions for certain beliefs, religious practices or otherwise, and we're seeing human rights legislation incorporates that. But I think the charter incorporates another area, which is freedom of conscience, which is the ability to be able to make that decision based on certain moral grounds that you hold. I noticed that that's not incorporated in certain provincial pieces of legislation. How do you think that might play out?
Well, even the human rights legislation has grounds around religion and creed, and the idea is that there needs to be a genuine belief. And, these things become very sort of, most religions don't address the sort of, the sort of intervention that we're talking about here. So these cases become very sort of fact driven, and it's hard to make a sort of a general, a general observation or a general rule about whether freedom of conscience will work, or a life, liberty, and security of the person potentially, and that's a claim that could go, either way.
Yeah, yes, either way, and of course subject to the reasonable limits in a democratic society. And I think that this is the big question that people are asking. We have these fundamental freedoms, we have these rights, but yet there's the caveat in the charter which says that that these are subject to certain limitations